We are back with episode 13 of Firearms Law with Francois. In this episode, we continue answering questions as received from viewers regarding legal private defense. Francois, good morning. Welcome back. It's been a while.
Thank you, Rian. Yes, it has indeed been a while, and I'm happy to be back.
Okay, I'm going to just kick off with the first question. We have 4 questions to cover. Since private defense is not limited to protecting myself, who else may I defend and when? What are the practical and legal considerations if I protect a stranger or get involved in an incident between unknown third parties?
So, Rian, in principle, you can successfully rely on private defense in defense of any legally recognized interest, as we said, provided you obviously comply with all the other requirements. So, in principle, you could protect anyone or an interest of anyone, whether you know that person or not, or whether you have, let's say, a personal interest in their well-being or not. But there are massive risks involved in this. The first being simply a misunderstanding of who is the attacker and who is the aggressor in a particular let's call it fight or confrontation that you now decide to get involved in to supposedly protect the innocent party. So you can imagine how dynamic these situations are, and as we discussed previously, it is possible also to exceed the bounds of private defense. In other words, you go too far in defending yourself against a certain unlawful attack. And then, to the extent that you are exceeding the bounds of private defense, that is unlawful in itself. And now the attacker is now entitled to act in private defense against you to that extent, at least. And you can now understand this becomes a very confusing back and forth where, afterwards, with the benefit of hindsight and witnesses and documents and timelines and this and that, it's often difficult for the court to determine, who was who and which is which in these scenarios. So it's very dangerous to think that you are just going to, in a certain instance, make the right call and know exactly who is who, right? Yeah, I'm not saying you shouldn't or you couldn't. I'm saying that these are the practical risks involved. And one of the requirements that I think we didn't cover it, because I mentioned previously that you can make the requirements or elements for private defense more or less depending on how academic you want to be. We covered essentially 6, you would recall. 3 elements regarding the nature of the attack, and 3 regarding the nature of the defense for you to say you acted in legitimate lawful private defense. But one of the requirements that you could call a 7th requirement if you wanted to is that you must be aware that you are acting in private defense. There's no such thing as accidental or coincidental private defense. So, for instance, if you were to provoke someone in order to have them attack you, and then you claim unlawful defense in respect or private defense in respect of that, it wouldn't be legitimate, because the provocation would mean that, at least to a certain extent, that attack against you wouldn't be, let's say, unlawful. It would be a defensive attack, depending exactly on the nature of the back and forth. You know what I mean? But the point is, you must knowingly and let's say with the pure heart, if I can put it that way, know that you are acting in private defense. Also, you cannot, for instance, let's say you shoot someone because you want to eliminate them for whatever reason, and afterwards it turns out that they actually had a plot to kill you 5 seconds after you killed them. You would still be guilty of murder in that instance, because you weren't aware subjectively that you were acting in private defense, and therefore it is your personal intention, or your gewete, as we can say, that is actually punished by the law, not necessarily what turns out to be the objective facts after the fact, right? So yes, every person needs to make a determination for themselves whether they will and when they will get involved in scenarios to, let's say, save unknown third parties. And I think in that scenario, we must all be mindful of our convictions or our prejudices and our ability to misunderstand a particular scenario. I see every day in my work how my perception of a certain incident changes over time. And, you deal with, let's say, a criminal trial or whatever for months and months. And when it's eventually finalized and you've heard evidence from all the sides and you've seen all the police investigations and this and that, and you're still not sure exactly what happened, So I know that's often because you weren't there, and you imagine that had you been there, you would know exactly what happened. But we see every day how 5 witnesses describe the same incident completely differently from their own point of view, without one of them even necessarily being dishonest or unreliable or something like that, So yes, it's a very dynamic scenario. And look, sometimes it's clear, and we say that all that is required for evil to flourish is, for good men to do nothing. But you mustn't assume that you can always make those judgments properly, and you mustn't assume that the law will see you or the other people in the scenario who might also then now act against you might not see you as this good man. And I guess you must consider the implications of those actions for yourself and on yourself, on your own life, and how that will perhaps impact your ability to, in future, protect, let's call it, your primary concern, your family or your loved ones or that. So to get back to the short answer, yes, you can protect an unknown third party in private defense, but that's a call you have to make, and I would say be very cautious before you get involved in unknown people's unknown fights.
It's a bit of a tightrope.
Yes.
Before I proceed to the next question, just for the viewers, Francois mentioned those 6 points regarding private defense. If you want to check that out, check out the previous episode 12. We addressed them in a lot more detail there. So do that and check it out. Next question, Francois. The Defensive Act must be directed against the attacker and not a third party. What happens if there is a defensive shooting in public and I end up injuring or killing an innocent bystander by accident?
All right. So, as you mentioned, the requirement applicable here is it must be directed against the attacker. Now, let's assume you want to direct your shooting, your defensive shooting at the attacker. So in a sense, you do comply with that requirement, but it doesn't land there. It lands on an innocent bystander. So in that sense, it wasn't directed at the attacker, if you know what I mean. And now the question is, what happens if you get charged? Let's assume this bystander dies and you get charged with murder in respect of the bystander. Okay, now you cannot rely on private defense in respect of a charge of murdering the innocent bystander because there was no unlawful attack from that person. All right. Keeping in mind, obviously, there was from someone else. Right. So there are various possibilities that could happen here. So as far as proving a charge of murder, the state needs to prove intent, right? And intent comes in different forms, or dolus, as we call it in Latin. We get what we call dolus directus, or direct intent. That's basically, I want to kill Riaan and I kill Riaan. Okay, that's the straightforward one. Indirectus, or indirect intent, is where essentially I want to kill Riaan, but Riaan is standing on the other side of a window. And I know that necessarily for me to kill Riaan, I have to shoot through the window. And if I were then to be charged with malicious injury to property for breaking the window, I would have indirect intent on that offense, because my direct will was actually to shoot Riaan, but I knew and accepted and proceeded to break the window in time to do so. So I have indirect intent in respect of breaking the window. And then the third one, I would say those two, for argument's sake, do not apply to our scenario, because clearly the person did not want to kill the innocent bystander, and they did not foresee it as a necessary thing that they would have to do. So it's not a scenario of, I'm going to shoot through this innocent bystander to shoot the killer behind him. It's a question of, you miss the killer and you shoot the innocent bystander, or the attacker, or the robber, or whatever you want to call him, right? So the third option might apply, the third form of intent, which we call dolus eventualis. This is what featured greatly in the trial of Mr. Oscar Pistorius, where it was argued that it was perhaps not proven that he wanted to kill Riva Steenkamp, but he did fire shots through a door to what he believed to be a person in circumstances where it was found that he was not entitled to do so. And he did foresee, even though his intention wasn't proven to be to kill that person, he did foresee, or should have foreseen, that it, well, did foresee, because otherwise it would have been negligent. But he did foresee that as a possible result, or an eventual result, or a possibility, and he, despite that, proceeded. All right. So, well, that would be more or less the logic for dolus eventualis, right?
Okay.
So the question then becomes, if that was foreseeable and you reconciled yourself with that possibility, then you could be guilty of murder of this innocent bystander. But now, obviously, the defender, or let's call it the accused, who is now charged with the death of this innocent bystander, would obviously argue that he was trying to save his own life in a split second, and that is why he shot at the attacker and then missed, and whatever. So he didn't, foresee and reconcile himself with that result, meaning that it can't be murder, right? So the defense of necessity, which we covered previously, does come into play here. Not in the sense that it was necessary, obviously, to shoot the innocent bystander, but it was necessary to fire the shots at the attacker, and the circumstances were such that a bystander could get hurt, and this now materialized, right? So now the court will have to determine whether you were entitled to shoot, and whether you were entitled to shoot in the manner in which you did. And then it becomes a balancing act, between the interest affected, in other words, this innocent person's life on the one hand, but on the other hand, you were protecting innocent life yourself. Now, what we must also remember is we must distinguish unlawfulness from fault. So obviously, it's unlawful to shoot an innocent bystander because there was no unlawful attack from him. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have fault in the criminal sense, either in the form of intent or negligence. Right now, we've covered now the intent portion of it, and you might not have a legal defense per se, which renders your conduct lawful, but the state must still establish criminal culpability, either in the form of intent or murder, right? Or intent or negligence, i.e. murder or culpable homicide. Now, let's cover negligence in the event that you did not foresee that you would hit the innocent bystander when you decided to shoot the attacker. The question becomes whether that was reasonable. So the court will ask whether the reasonable man, in the circumstances of the accused, would have foreseen this possibility and would have taken steps to avoid it. In other words, would not have shot, or would have shot differently. Or the court might say, no, the reasonable man in the circumstances would have acted the same way, and therefore he lacks either intent or negligence, and there's no offense committed, right? Now, it becomes difficult because this test of the reasonable man, you often hear people, I think, misusing the term quite innocently as being some broad legal test to determine whether anybody's conduct in circumstances, is lawful or not. It's not that. The test for the reasonable man is specifically the test for determining negligence in criminal law. So let's say for culpable homicide or some other offense that requires negligence. Now, in the circumstances where you are now a firearms owner and you have to shoot somebody in a split second, the court obviously does consider the suddenness and the let's say the overwhelmingness of the scenario, right? So you are judged as a person in those circumstances, not a person with hindsight who can academically approach the situation and decide whether to shoot or not. But even in those circumstances, gross negligence is not tolerated. So you are still expected to act reasonably, and that might mean that you have to be more careful in when you shoot or don't shoot or how you shoot, right? And remember that the court will judge you as the so-called, let's call it the test of the reasonable firearms owner. Now, there's no such test per se, but this test for the reasonable man is adapted to the specific scenario, because we have to ask, what would the man in the shoes of the accused have done? And that man, in your instance or in our instance, would be assuming you would have a competency certificate, you would have a firearm license, you went through certain proficiency training. So the court will judge you as a firearms owner and somebody who is supposedly proficient in the handling of their firearm. Whereas, let's say a person who doesn't own a firearm, but in the same scenario needs to act in private defense, and there's a firearm lying on the floor and they pick it up and they perhaps shoot an innocent bystander, they will not be judged by exactly the same standard than what you are. So I think that's another reason for training and proficiency, and also running these scenarios through your mind so that you can make up your mind as to how you see it, and then probably you stand a better chance in the real scenario, as opposed to not even having tried to build some mental capacity to deal with the situation. So yes, I think that answers the question.
Okay.
It can be many things, Rian, but these are the possibilities.
Yeah, I think there are hardly ever totally straightforward answers. Um, so none of these questions are that easy to answer. Okay, it must be this or it must be that. There's always, it can be this, it can be that. The court would look at this, etc., etc. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. But I think
Yeah.
it's important that people have a good understanding of the basics of the law as applicable to firearms and defending yourself.
Yeah.
All right, next question. What happens if I'm under the mistaken belief that an attack is imminent and my life is in danger, while in fact it is not? For instance, when someone points a real-looking but harmless toy gun at me and I shoot him.
All right. So let's say, for argument's sake, in this instance, there's no unlawful attack, depending on the nature. So a person could point a toy gun at you to make you believe that it is a real firearm, and in that instance, it's obviously an unlawful attack. But it could not even be, objectively speaking, an unlawful attack, because it might be that somebody was actually pulling a prank or making a joke. All right. And in that instance, you would also have a problem with, even if it was a true unlawful attack, you technically have a problem with proportionality, because even though you don't know it, this person is not posing a real threat to you, at least not by means of the toy gun. But you do not know that, right? Now, as we mentioned, I think before, the test for private defense, in other words, how the court will judge it, is based on these objective factors. But obviously, the objective factors are applied to the subjective scenario. So objectively, clearly, in your question, there's no true private defense. But we have what we call a defense of putative private defense. Now, putative essentially in this context means genuine belief but mistaken belief, right? So let's say you act under the genuine belief that you are acting in private defense, and you now, let's say, shoot this person pointing a toy gun at you. Let's say, to make it clear, under circumstances where it does appear to you quite clearly that it is an unlawful attack and you genuinely believe that it is, you shooting that person is technically unlawful, because there was no unlawful attack against you per se, or there was a lack of proportionality, or whatever it is. But as in the previous example that we discussed, unlawfulness does not mean fault. And if you truly, genuinely believed that you were acting in private defense, you could succeed with the defense of putative private defense. Now, in this instance, it becomes a subjective test. Usually the test for private defense, like I say, is objective, but now we have to look at your subjective belief, whether you believed it was a firearm or not. But what happens if a person who is clearly completely unreasonable now concludes that it is a firearm, and he truly subjectively believes it? Does that mean he can just shoot anything that looks like a firearm being pointed at him? No, because that subjective belief must be objectively reasonable, if I can put it that way. So all of that becomes, I think, a bit academic, but essentially, if you act under the genuine, bona fide, reasonable belief that you are acting in private defense, while in fact you are not, you can still succeed with the defense of putative private defense in such an instance.
Okay. Last but not least, and I know that this one specifically has a very long-winded reply if you want to go into details. So I'm going to suggest that for this video, episode 12, maybe you just give us a broad outline and then we do a separate episode where we go into a lot more depth around this because it's a very interesting subject. The question is, we previously made a point of emphasizing that even though private defense does not provide for protection of your property, this does not mean that you may shoot someone who is trying to steal your things. So, let's assume a scenario where my life or limb is not in danger, but only my things. As our law stands today, can it ever be justified to use lethal force in defense of a property?
All right. So just to go back slightly, as you mentioned, you can defend any legally recognized interest under private defense, and obviously your property is a recognized interest. But private defense does not mean a gun. It does not mean killing or shooting someone. It simply means that you use a certain form of force against a certain attack. So private defense could even be just using your mouth to defend yourself when you are insulted, or slapping a person who slaps you, or shooting a person for argument's sake, right? So, and using a gun obviously can mean many different things as well. Using a gun on the one end of the spectrum can be saying to you, listen, I have a gun, to hopefully intimidate you or at least get you to leave me alone. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's literally killing someone, and lots of things can happen in between: pointing, pistol whipping, shooting, injuring, whatever it is. Yeah, let's just say when a firearm gets used, let's assume for purposes of this question, as you said that you use lethal force, and not necessarily lethal force, but let's limit it to you shoot someone to defend your things, all right? Because you can imagine many instances these things overlap. You might be protecting your vehicle and or yourself in the vehicle and or your family around the vehicle. So it's not only your property, it's also your life or also your limb or this and that. But let's say for argument's sake, you're going to shoot someone and they're either going to die or be injured, and you are purely protecting property. Okay, that is essentially, I think, the question that we want to answer. And as you can imagine, this is going to come down to proportionality at the end of the day. What did I do with the gun, and what property was I protecting, and under what circumstances, right? So it's a long answer, Jan, as you've alluded to already. And in short, we have to go all the way back to a certain judgment called Ex parte die Minister van Justisie in Rye S versus Van Wyk, which is a 1967 decision. Now, essentially, this was a shopkeeper who set up a shotgun trap inside his shop.
Oh,
And
yes.
when it was burgled for this so manyth time, a certain intruder was hit by this shotgun, and this actually killed the intruder. And the guy, Mr. Van Wyk, was charged with murder, and he was initially acquitted of murder. In other words, the court found that you can, in extremely limited circumstances, I might add, because the court considered his scenario to be very exceptional. The court said that you can, in these exceptional circumstances, in principle, use force and perhaps lethal force in defense of strictly property. Because remember, this was his shop at night, he wasn't home. So it's not an argument of, yes, I'm protecting my house, but also myself and also my family, or this and that, right? So this was such an unusual and unique finding, and the Minister of Justice at the time was so surprised, you could say, by it, that he actually escalated the matter to get certain legal questions answered, because the state was under the impression that this would be a clear-cut case of murder. He was only protecting his property, not life or limb, and then he ended up being acquitted. So the matter was escalated to the Appeal Division of the Supreme Court, as it was known then. It's basically today the Supreme Court of Appeal. And at the time, we had no constitutional court, so that was the highest court in the land. And they basically went through this issue back and forth, and they essentially found that, yes, the acquittal must stand. In other words, they confirmed the decision that you may, in extremely limited circumstances, use force and potentially lethal force in protection of purely your property, right? But of the 5 judges that considered this matter, 2 dissented. In other words, 2 did not agree with the finding. So
Okay.
really you have I don't want to call it a 50-50 decision, because now it did establish a certain precedent, as we say, but it was certainly not clear cut. And as I say, it was an extreme circumstance. In the meanwhile, many, many years have gone by. And believe it or not, you must imagine, obviously, there have been many instances where people protect property purely and use force or even lethal force. I've been involved in such instances. But in principle, this judgment still stands. Or let's say it hasn't been expressly rejected by our courts as no longer forming part of our law. But we have a new constitution now, well, since 1996 already. This constitution places a big emphasis on the right to life. The Constitutional Court has many years ago already abolished the death penalty. Now, I know we're talking about two different things: capital punishment for a convicted criminal versus acting in private defense and perhaps taking a life in the process. But our Constitutional Court has long ago said that we have such an high emphasis on the right to life that even a convicted serial murderer will not be killed by the state after he's been proven to be guilty, because his life is supposedly weighs heavier than the interest of the public in having him punished in that manner, right? So you can imagine that the courts are going to place that very same emphasis on the right to life if it comes to you having shot someone to protect purely your property. So yes, in essence, the answer is not no, you can't, because that wouldn't be the correct legal answer. But it certainly isn't a simple yes, you can. I think the safe way to answer it for now, and we'll deal with it in detail, is to say that under extreme and very limited circumstances, you might succeed with private defense after shooting someone to protect purely property. But you will typically have a problem with the requirement of proportionality. As we said, the balance between what is being attacked, your property, and what you are doing to stop that attack, in this instance, taking a life. Okay. And you will also typically have a problem with the requirement that it must be necessary. In other words, that you had no reasonable alternatives, right? But we'll get back to that. I think as practical advice, and I will repeat that later, I would say you must, as far as you can, refrain from using force or lethal force, especially purely to protect property. But it's unfortunately not a simple absolutely not or absolutely yes.
Okay. Now, for the viewers, there are 12 previous episodes. So please do yourself a favor, make time to go check them out, and then come back to us if you have questions that you feel we have not addressed as yet. Send it to us in the comments, and we will deal with them in time. And as always, if you like this episode, please click the like button. Please subscribe to the channel, and please share this video. And if you are interested in any of the training offered under the Loan Operator banner, check the link in the description below. And we look forward to seeing you on a range one of these days. Francois, thank you so much. Good to talk to you again.
Yes, Riaan, thanks very much. And sorry for being away for a while, but I'm glad we're back at it again.